Welcome to Rumor versus Truth, your trusted source for facts, where we dissect the evidence behind risky rumors and reveal clinical truths. Today, we'll shed some light on the facts and rumors about sunscreens.
Well, hello. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Don.
You are just looking positively glowing.
Stunning in a bad way because I am red as a lobster. And for those folks who can't see us, I'm wearing a fishing hat with a lovely burn all across my face and sunglasses, which I have to take off.
Right. And I am wearing a fairly large hat that's covering probably almost most of my screen, some sunglasses, and a little bit of a dollop of sunscreen on my nose.
But you're not red.
No, I did it right. This thing blocks like 50 feet all around me. So
Brilliant. And before we move on, Don, I do have to fess up to our audience. I'm not sporting a real burn. I am wearing makeup.
okay.
I'm sure you were thinking maybe he's born with it. Maybe it's sun damage.
Yeah.
But it's a great segue into our topic for today, which is sunscreens. And I have to ask you, Don, are you a spray or a slather type of person when it comes to sunscreens?
I'm a slather. I will jump in a pool of it.
Yeah, and that's probably what I should be doing too. Because when it comes to sun protection, is not a joke. But honestly, hey folks, I'm Steve the pharmacist, and I'm clearly regretting not wearing SPF 30 to this episode. I'm feeling the heat, Don.
Right. And I am Don the pharmacist. And Steve, I gotta say, you are glowing, like I said, but not in that good way. More like forgot to reapply at the beach, sat near a nuclear reactor kind of glowing.
Right, and we'll
Uh,
talk all about reapplying later.
Right, right. And in this episode, before we actually get into it, let me take off this hat because
Yes,
it is
please.
way too small for my head. And I'll take off these sunglasses as well. And we're about to get under your skin, literally, by breaking down what's fact and what is just sensational fiction. Promise keep the puns count high and the UV index low.
And we're about to throw some shade at sunscreen myths and help make sure sunburns don't make your summer into a third degree bummer, folks. And this is not just a topic for pharmacists and techs. This topic is good for non medical folks too, family and friends. So spread the word.
Definitely. And stick around to the end. We'll also answer a listener's question about GLP-1s from our last episode on retro rumors.
Nice.
Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into that first claim, right? So shine a light on the rumor that has been going around for a long time. And the claim is the higher the SPF, the better for most people.
Hmm.
Now, let's go with something we all know, right? We know the use of sunscreen helps prevent certain skin carcinomas like melanoma and squamous cell and the like, and photoaging, wrinkles. Excuse me to get nerdy for a quick second here. UV stands for ultraviolet. We have UVA and UVB rays, right? They've both been implicated in skin cancer. UVA rays penetrate deeper into the skin and associated with the melanoma, which is the most serious type of skin cancer. It's associated with aging and wrinkles. UVB rays are responsible for sunburns and the non-melanoma skin cancer. So SPF, which stands for sun protection factor, refers to the amount of UVB protection that a product provides, but not UVA.
Yeah, that's a good breakdown that there are different UV rays there,
Mm.
Don. But there's lots of advertising around sunscreens, SPF 30, 40, 50. Where does it end? Are we talking SPF 1 million? Can you put a spotlight on those numbers for folks?
Definitely can. Let's go and put those in perspective, right? So SPF 15 blocks about 93% of UVB rays, SPF 30 about 97%, SPF 50 about 98%. So you can see there's not exactly a doubling or tripling of the percentage of UVB blocking the higher SPF you go. And like with UVB, it's generally accepted that UVA protection increases with higher SPFs as well. That's why we recommend broad spectrum that can block both UVA and UVB.
Nice. And what do studies show, though? Does this mean higher SPFs provide better skin cancer protection?
Yeah, good question. So, marketing, right, comes down to higher SPF. Am I more protected against certain things? So, it's been shown that there's not a decrease in skin cancer risk with higher than SPF of 30 for most people.
Okay.
So, let's boil it down to recommendations then. So, what should we recommend to people if they ask? So, suggest a broad spectrum, like I mentioned, product, an SPF of at least 15 to 30 for most people. Anything higher than SPF 30 doesn't really provide much more protection as I outlined earlier.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and go back to that claim. And it is the higher the SPF, the better for most people. And the verdict is that is a rumor. So like I said, we're recommending SPF at least 15 to 30. Anything above 30 for most people is usually not needed.
Okay. But with that in mind, since you said most people, what about the
Mm,
others, the some people outside of that?
Yep. So good catch on that one. Most people, or the some that are out there, like you're saying. So yes, people with a history of skin cancer or who are at high risk for skin cancer, an SPF of 50 is actually recommended. So this is because that extra bump, I was talking about the percentage wise, how there's not a linear kind of percent increase in protection, but that 1% from 30 to 50 can mean the difference in that population subset of skin cancer risk and history of it.
Okay, so for those folks, go big or go home when it comes with that SPF. That's
Correct.
that's really
Correct.
good to know, Don. And
Mm,
I've probably been applying sunscreen wrong all these years, clearly.
mhm.
But are there any risks to blocking out all that sun? And our next claim is that sunscreens reduce vitamin D production. And this is interesting, Don, because it has been suggested that 5 to 30 minutes of sun exposure outside without sunscreen between like the hours of 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. each day, maybe twice a week, is good because doing that for the face, arms, legs, or back will generally provide adequate vitamin D producing UV rays because we make that in our skin. But studies have shown that using those UVB blocking sunscreens or clothing, for example, regularly can reduce vitamin D blood levels by up to 30%. And hearing that, I could see people being like, wow, that's quite a bit. But before we pick a bone with this, let's put it into perspective here. This 30% drop is still probably within acceptable levels for most healthy adults, those with healthy diets or no kidney disease, right? And most people, to be honest, don't apply enough sunscreen anyways to all exposed skin to block all
Mm,
of those UVB rays. So keep that in mind.
right. So that kind of brings up something here, vitamin D and, up to 30% reduction in it, that drop. 2D or not 2D, right? That is the question. If people want to supplement vitamin D because they feel like they're not getting enough of those sun's rays, what's the advice there?
Yeah, it can depend on a lot of factors. And I recommend folks check out our calcium and vitamin D FAQ chart online. It lists recommendations on daily intake, depending on patient age and other factors. And we have a whole episode on this topic with our sister podcast, Clinical Capsules. So folks should definitely check that out. So when it comes to this claim that sunscreens reduce vitamin D production, the verdict is true, but with conditions. Yes, studies show that it can reduce those levels, but it may not be clinically significant for a lot of folks. So keeping that in mind.
Okay, so Steve, obviously you're putting sunscreen under your eyes. I'm putting it on my nose. This is not the amount to put on, right?
Right.
So, how much sunscreen should folks actually be applying to themselves?
Yeah, well, after this burn, I have
Mm,
definitely found out the right amount. Technically, you should apply at least 1 ounce, so amount of maybe a shot glass of sunscreen liberally to exposed skin about 15 minutes beforehand before going into the sun. And then you also have to reapply every 2 hours. I think that's a point that a lot of people forget. And you also have to do it after swimming or sweating, depending on the product, since it could wash off. And also, folks, don't forget about your ears. Those burn really easily, and many people forget to shade them. And also, speaking of ears, I want to hear some sunburn horror stories. Let's make some dermatologists cringe here. Right into the show using the send us a text link, and we'll share the best or worst one for the next episode.
yeah. And please don't feel like obligated to send pictures of it. Descriptions are
Right.
just fine, right? Yeah. Okay, so move on to the next claim. Another patient factor I've heard brought up about sunscreen is skin tone. And the claim here is sunscreen isn't as important for people with darker skin tone.
Hmm.
Now, let's go back to the facts here. Patients with darker skin tones, yeah, they are more protected against skin damage than lighter skin tones. The reason why that is because the melanin that's in the skin has the ability to absorb UV light before it actually can cause damage to skin cells. This is why we see, skin cancer rates and skin damage are lower in darker toned people than lighter. But, you know, this does not mean that they don't need sunscreen when exposed to UV rays, actually. There was a study in 2016 that showed that when darker toned people do get skin cancer, the rate of death was actually higher than those with light skinned people. So let's go back to that claim again. And it is sunscreen isn't as important for people with darker skin tone. And the verdict is that is a rumor. Key point, everyone, again, everyone needs sunscreen or some kind of sun protection when they're outside, regardless of melanin concentration in their skin.
Yeah, that's really good to highlight, Don. And when you say that, though, I think about how I've heard some people with darker toned skin feeling that some sunscreens make their skin look
Mhm.
awful. What should they do
Yeah.
there then?
Yeah. So in those particular cases, it could be definitely visible to the point where you maybe not even want to put it on, right?
Right.
So you actually can point these patients to the sheer sunscreens or those with darker tints or shades if patients want to address cosmetic issues with the lighter color versions. In fact, I was researching this, Steve, and I've seen some products where the company will match the shade of your skin, send them a picture, and they will use some, photo technology to
Hmm.
come up with these different color tints, like you would go at a paint store, right? All paint is just a set of numbers of different colors mixed into one
Oh,
kind of
wow.
can. Same thing with sunscreens. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, that's cool.
And, yeah, and some people may ask, like, well, can I just add tint color to my existing sunscreen? And I
Hmm.
would say no to that one, only because if you add kind of foreign chemicals to an already existing sunscreen product, it may compromise effectiveness and expiration dates as well.
Yeah, leave it to the professionals, folks.
Mhm.
And before we get into our next claim, a quick reminder if you're enjoying this episode and want access to even more clinical insights, check out Pharmacist Letter, Pharmacy Technician's Letter, and Prescriber Insights. As a listener, you can get 10% off a new subscription with the podcast code podcast1025 at checkout. And that leads to our next claim, Dawn. And it can be quite heated. You may want to reapply or not, because the claim is sunscreen ingredients are harmful to humans. Kind of scary, right? Well, data have shown that chemical sunscreens, things like oxybenzone and avobenzone, have been absorbed into the skin and into the bloodstream at low levels. But before people worry about that, there is no credible link to adverse events with this low level in the bloodstream. And more testing is obviously needed before we
Ugh.
make any claims like this.
Right, right. So you're saying, like, okay, there's no data showing that has an effect yet, even though it is in the bloodstream.
Right.
You're going to have patients, maybe even me, maybe in my own family,
Yeah.
will say, well, I don't want these chemicals at all in my bloodstream. Okay.
Yeah.
So what do we recommend in these
And
cases?
that's a totally fair point. What you can do is guide patients if they want to try natural options, especially if they're pregnant, for example. For instance, you could recommend zinc oxide or titanium dioxide based sunscreens, or rely on photoprotective clothing that's darker in color and perhaps a tighter weave, things like that. So, yeah, there are options there. And when going back to this claim that sunscreen ingredients are harmful to humans, the verdict is rumor. As we saw, even though they can be absorbed in the bloodstream, we don't have any credible evidence that they lead to adverse effects. And, one thing that kind of brings up, Dawn, is that there has been talk about low levels of benzene, a carcinogen found in
Hmm.
some
Okay.
sunscreens. I recommend folks listen to our June episode of Rumor versus Truth, where we debunk rumors about that and other benzene cases and topical products.
Yeah. Just to bring up a quick point, even though sunscreens, to be shown, aren't toxic necessarily, some medications like your fluoroquinolones and your tetracyclic antibiotics may deposit certain photoreactive chemicals in the skin, actually, what increases the risk of sunburn. People who have taken doxycycline before, they burn very easily and they wonder why.
Yeah,
And
good
that's
point.
because of the reason. So we do have a great resource on this that meds that increase sunburn risks. So be sure to slap on that sunscreen more in these particular cases.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go and move on to our last claim here. And speaking of you did mention the zinc and the titanium sunscreen options, right, Steve? But here's a claim where the sun never really seems to set on. And here it is. The claim is chemical and mineral sunscreens work in the same way.
Hmm.
Well, let's go ahead and dissect those, right? So chemical sunscreens use like a synthetic chemical, like you mentioned, oxybenzone or octisalate that absorb UV rays so they don't cause damage. On the other hand, you look at the mineral sunscreens, like you mentioned, that contain elements like the zinc or titanium, they act like a physical barrier against UV rays. So they don't absorb, they just actually have a physical barrier that blocks the UV rays to reflect or scatter them instead of absorbing them. And depending on how they're formulated, they can achieve the same SPF as chemical sunscreens. And, going back on that, if mineral options, since they're more natural and inert, they may have less incidences of like stuff like allergic reactions, which actually can happen with chemical sunscreens.
Sure.
Some advantages of mineral sunscreens actually include things like they work immediately. Other something you have to like apply, then wait 15, 30 minutes before go out in the sun. Minerals work immediately, and they could be better for the environments, especially those oceanic reefs.
Interesting. And titanium, it sounds like a suit of armor against the
It
sun. How
does.
fancy.
Hmm.
But, Don, are there any downsides to think about with these mineral based options?
Yeah, it may feel like you're wearing a suit of armor in that particular case. So the mineral-based options actually tend to be thicker
Yeah.
and are not really as water resistant as the chemical ones. And the reason I say suit of armor is because they tend to leave like this visible film on your skin.
Hmm.
That can happen. So kind of warn patients about, the it's a little more complex when it comes to applying these things
Sure.
and to warn them about the issues when choosing those mineral-based options. So let's go ahead and go back to that claim from earlier. And it is chemical and mineral sunscreens work in the same way. And the verdict is rumor. Chemical sunscreens actually absorb UV rays so they don't cause damage, while mineral sunscreens act like that barrier to actually reflect or scatter those UV rays.
Nice. And Don, I saw a mineral based sunscreen labeled reef safe and anti aging at the store. Is that for the coral or for me?
And it depends who's aging faster, Steve.
Oh, okay, Don, that was a bit too spicy.
Okay.
Folks, I just got burned by Don here.
Yeah, you don't need to be burned anymore. You're
Yeah,
you're
true.
you're the max level of it. Yeah.
Insult to
So
injury.
but bring an important point. So some products will do say reef safe, but that is not really a standard term. So be sure to rely on product's ingredient list and not its marketing to see it's affecting the environment.
Yeah. And I think it leads us to our bottom line truth here, folks. Always think about sun safety. In general, use a broad spectrum sunscreen with at least an SPF of 15 to 30. And like we said earlier, slather it on generously and often because when it comes to sun protection, you don't want to be left high and dry with your skin in the sun spotlight. We all have skin in the game when it comes to this, right?
Good one. Thank you, Steve. And it looks like rumors actually shone brightly today. So it seems that there's a ton of rumors out there about sunscreens, which mean healthcare providers, especially pharmacists, technicians, might see a lot of questions and are in great position this summer to help patients find some truths like we did today.
Totally agree. And if you do find yourself bombarded with patient questions about sunscreen, this episode only scratched the surface of what we cover on the topic. So if you enjoyed our discussion, you'll love the additional resources we've linked in the show notes. Don't miss the article on sunscreens in the July 2025 issue of Pharmacist Letter, Pharmacy Technicians Letter, and Prescriber Insights, along with the clinical resource Shedding Light on Questions about Sunscreens.
Yeah, these are exclusive to our subscribers, so make sure you sign up and unlock the treasure trove of valuable information. Okay, so I did promise everybody that we would kind of revisit the GLP-1 question from the last
Hmm.
episode from our 40th anniversary. So the audience question from that last episode is, when you mentioned GLP-1 agonists are now approved for weight loss, do patients need to take these meds for the rest of their lives to maintain their weight? This is a great question. Hear this all the time.
I agree. And,
Mhm.
I would say this depends since obesity and its complications can depend on many factors, and obesity can be seen as a chronic medical condition, right? But in general, GLP 1s should be seen, I would say, as a long term med until we have more evidence. For example, studies we found suggest that patients often regain about half of the weight lost within a year of stopping these meds. And uh, these also should be combined with lifestyle changes, things like diet and exercise, which might help keep weight off in some cases, but possibly not all patients. And I would say it really all comes down to tailoring to the patient's needs. One option I can think of, perhaps after a patient gets their goal weight, is to taper the GLP-1 slowly. Or you could even consider stopping the med and maybe adding it back for a few months later if the patient starts to regain weight again. So, a lot of good thoughts here. And if you'd like to have your question about this episode answered next month, send us a message.
We also use your suggestions to plan our episodes. Send us your ideas for rumors and truth to analyze at trchealthcare.com/contact us, or use the contact us link at the bottom of your TRC Healthcare homepage, or send us a text right from the podcast show notes.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. And a couple more things here before we go have fun in the sun.
Not you, Steve. Stay out of the sun forever.
Yeah, I need
But
to recuperate.
if you liked what you heard on this episode, be sure to follow, rate, and review Rumor versus Truth wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, check us out at trchealthcare.com. You can help also grow our show by telling your friend about the awesome things you've learned about and where you found us.
Yeah, and as a listener to our show, you have access to a special 10% discount on a new subscription. Again, just use the code podcast1025 when you check out. And if you're a student, even better, students can access a free version of Pharmacist Letter. We've got links in the show notes that take you directly to the right places to take advantage of these awesome deals, so go check them out.
Yep. And join us next time when we'll discuss acne products. We'd love for you to pop on in when it comes out.
That's really gross, Don. And thanks for joining us on Rumor versus Truth, your trusted source for facts, where we dissect the evidence behind risky rumors and reveal clinical truths. See you next time.